see all of you come out here, invest this time. I would dare say that it's usually the cream of the crop that either that or you just have a real pain point somewhere with septic systems. But somebody that's willing to invest their time to come out for an evening like this, it says something about your interest, your professional interest as a realtor, and I want to commend you for that. Just a second here, we're going to start with introductions. Before we do, I mentioned earlier, but a few new people came in. We do have a sign-up sheet over there. You can get it at break time if you didn't. Get your email on there, and as soon as David gets finished uploading it, we'll email you the YouTube link from tonight so that you can share it to others or review it again and say, what was he saying there again? Because we might share some things that are a bit new. I think we're going to start with an opening prayer. If you're a person of faith, you can join in, or just a moment of silence. Lord, we thank you for this time together. Thank you that we can be here, and we want to glorify your name tonight. Give us open minds and give us wisdom, and give those of us who are sharing the ability to communicate what we're trying to say. And we ask all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. All right, I'm going to start with introductions. My name's Merle Weaver, my brother Matt, and there's another Matt, so we don't get this thoroughly mixed up tonight. We at least tried. I started in the septic business in 1998 and started the business that has now become Sonco. In 2000, in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, trained Matt in. He learned everything I taught him and passed me up a long time ago. So when it comes to septic specialties, Matt's your go-to guy. And then got back into the septic business a number of years ago after being involved in just business in general and other things in septic systems. And now I head septic systems up, and we install septic systems. I'll let Matt tell you what he does. From septic systems, we have two of our guys here. You guys stand up. There's Marvin, and behind him's Dave. He's our foreman. Jamie just walked in the back door. He's a dump truck driver and keeps everybody straight, as in maintaining and repairing all the equipment. So I'll let Matt introduce the Sonco side of things. I think that's all I have to say right now about septic. Matt?
Welcome. Also want to thank each of you for coming out. My name's Matt, and I'm with Sonco. Formerly known as Sonlight, but we just recently did a name change for just some clarification purposes. So anyway, the new name that you'll see is Sonco, but still Sonlight. So anyway, I've been doing this for ever since high school age, 17, 18. I just grew into family business and really enjoy being involved. Sometimes things really get kind of on the edge, especially when it relates to real estate transactions and deadlines, settlements, things like that. So I'm here to serve. That's why I continue working at Sonco. I love trying to help others out. And there's some times I drop balls, and I just ask you to be patient with us in them few moments that do happen. Other than that, we're just looking in the future. Want to give you some new technologies, things like that, that I think really could impact the septic industry. So that, oh yeah, sorry. Let me step to this side. And just recently, about a year ago, Jonathan here is an assistant in inspection, so we're glad he could join us in helping we do lots of PSMA inspections. He's been involved on that end of things, and he's also really helped in the office with assistant in that. So we also welcome Jonathan here. At that point, Matt, do you want to come front, introduce yourself?
Sure, I can.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Bixler. I'm with Premier Tech Aqua. So I'm our corporate office is located in Canada, and I am located here in Pennsylvania. My official title is National Sales Manager, so what that means is I don't know a whole lot about anything. We have guys that do. So we have sales reps here in Pennsylvania that are manufacturer reps. Their sole job is to work with partners like Sonco. And between the two of them, okay, we have a lot of experience. In fact, Mike, who is Sonco's rep, he's an SEO, he's a designer, he was an installer, he's been doing this for 20 plus years. So he has a lot of knowledge. So when you couple that up with their knowledge, we can really get by a lot of obstacles. So we'll go into our system near the end of the presentation. We'll show you what we have to offer and hope that you enjoy it. So there you are.
Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and go into the first part of the evening, the presentation here, is what is a septic system and what do you need to know about it? Certainly, we aren't going to take 20 years of experience and condense it down in a few minutes. We're just going to have a quick crash overview that hopefully lays a little bit of foundation. Maybe some of you know that 80% of what I share. I don't know, but we're just going to do a quick overview of what a septic system is. Naturally, you have your house, you got your streams of wastewater, gray water coming out from the house. In a typical town system, that would go straight to the public sewer down the street to the sewage treatment plant. But in a septic system, or another way to say it is on-site waste disposal system, you got it coming out. You have at least 2 or 3 minimal components. You got a tank. The purpose of that tank is to settle solids out and clarify, at least minimally, that waste before it goes to the absorption area. And whatever makes up that absorption area is basically a means of getting that clarified water, hopefully treated somehow, or clarified a bit before it gets released into the environment. In a typical septic system, you're using the ground as a filter. And we'll talk about that more a little later. And so the DEP and the people managing that have come up with a lot of rules about how much good ground, to put it in simple layman's terms, how much good ground do you need to clarify that waste before we get down into groundwater wells and things like that. We're going to take a quick look at a septic tank. So the waste is coming in from the house into this tank. Everything since what year, Matt, is 2 compartment? 96?
Or 2 tanks.
Okay, yeah, 2 compartment or 2 separate tanks. And again, the purpose there is we're doing our main sorting in this tank, and over here, it's like a further clarifying. So it comes in, we don't want that disturbing the liquid in that tank. We don't want it coming in, washing across the top of the tank. Therefore, there's some means, usually it's a PVC-T, but also in this kind, sometimes you have walls that do the same thing. But in any case, you're going to push that liquid down into the center. There, at least 24 hours, hopefully more, it's sitting there, has a chance for the sludge to settle out and scum to go on top. The scum is going to get digested by bugs, broken down to gas and sludge, and move on. So there we have the same thing. And again, on the same idea out here. You want to take it out of the middle so you're not taking sludge off the bottom or scum off the top to go out to the drain field. If this is missing, can somebody tell me what's going to happen? Just take a simple guess.
We'll go right out to the field.
That is correct. And what's going to happen next? You'll call a company like Sonco saying, we got to fix it. We got a problem. Because it's going to slime. It basically turns that absorption area in like a pool liner. And so we don't want this. When we find that problem, if it's not backed up, we fix it as quick as we can. And hopefully through the process of nature, what is out there can break down over time. This is where it all started years ago. Before we had septic tanks and drain fields, we had cesspool. What's wrong with a cesspool? Nothing's wrong with a cesspool. It's a very simple system, works very well. You stack blocks or stone around it, except 2 problems. Number one is this was done shortly after we graduated from an outhouse to basically an indoor outhouse. That's very different from today's house that's putting hundreds of gallons of water a day in there. It's not going to handle the flow. Additionally, depending how deep this cesspool goes, what's happening down here with groundwater. I remember, over the years, sometimes we pumped cesspools and they work backwards because the water table was that high, the water was pouring in. I'm just sitting there pumping and pumping and pumping. Finally, you decide, so when am I going to decide that I'm finished pumping this tank? Evidently, once my truck's full, but anyway, so cesspool, of course, has not been a viable option since at least the 1970s, if not before. Here's a typical conventional drain field. This is after it comes out of the tank. You could have a manifold line, you could have a D-box. Some way or another, you're getting that effluent, that wastewater out into a bed of stone. Now, this isn't covered, yes. This will be covered with stone and then a layer of dirt on top. But that's how a drain field looks. That's the most basic systems. I hear a lot of people say, well, they don't put them in anymore. Actually, I'm going to say there's a side of why people say that, but the reality is, since they've started testing soils, there's actually not many soils that meet this criteria that have the 72 inches of, like I said earlier, good dirt, which is what, because they've all been used up a long time ago. Now, there's places that are still doing that. There's places down in Chester County still doing it. There's places you can do that. But a lot of those places are now building on more marginal lots. Therefore, we have less good soil. We've got to come up with other means of filtering that effluent before it hits the groundwater. There's another variant of the drain field. Instead of a drain field, we've got trenches. It's called a trench system. Same basic thing. Here's an at-grade system. That's when, okay, we don't have 72 inches. We can't go down in, but we have still a good amount of good ground. Enough that if we just put the bed right on top of the ground, we can still use that good ground. Not near as big as a mound, but you got a small bump in the yard. Depending on how it is, you might be able to feather it in. It's not as big as the sand mound. And then is what I call the big ugly sand mound. I hate them. I always have. I think it's 1960s minus technology, and we don't need to be doing this anymore. But yes, I'm going to be honest, we still even put them in. I am longing for the day when I have a happy birthday celebration and put the last sand mound. I just take them. I think there's many reasons I hate them. Number one is they're big and they're ugly. They don't belong on properties. In fact, I call it burying a school bus. See, big, ugly sand mound bus. Think of that. It looks like somebody buried a bus in the backyard. And the other thing is the filter media, namely the sand, which is what the sand is, can clog up. The soil sand interface can clog up. The pump can go out. There's lots of things that can give problems, and always having lawnmowers hit the cleanouts. I wonder at any given time in southeast PA how many sand mounds are not functioning as they were designed because all the vent pipes were busted off by the lawnmower or something. So, but the way that works, it comes from the tank into a pump tank, a dosing tank, which, depending on the effluent level amount from the house at preset intervals, doses it up into the sand mound, loads it with 100, 200 gallons, however many gallons it sends out there, and it loads that all up and then leaves it settle down in and filter through the sand mound system. Then there's more advanced things like drip systems, where you can put a little a micro mound in the ground and get rid of the effluent through a drip tube. Naturally, you're going to have very clarified waste going in that because you can't handle dirty waste going into a drip system because it won't function very long that way. I think that's all I have on overview. Matt, if you're ready to talk about septic systems or inspections and why they're important. Why don't you put this thing on? You like that thing better? Okay.
Okay, inspections and why they are important. How many realtors here have had a septic inspection done? Probably most of you, some of you. Okay. So the question is, why are they important? First of all, we're going to look at the different types of inspections that we can do. One is PSMA. That's the main one that we do. Then we can also do non-PSMA inspections, And these type of inspections we only do for buyers just to satisfy bank requirements. That's the only time that we'll do a non-PSMA. And then hydraulic load tests, that's with PSMA inspections. How many of you have heard of a hydraulic load test? All right. Why is a hydraulic load test recommended or required? Anyone tell me? Well, it's right here. The dwelling is vacant, unoccupied for more than 1 week. Now, I'm also told that, I guess, certain FHA loan requirements, if it sits for over 6 months, is that correct? Can someone answer to that? 30 days, okay. I just found out about that. But as far as PSMA standards go, if it sits for more than 1 week. And then the other reason we can do a hydraulic load test is an unusual occurrence where the drain field is partially full of water and the level of water in the stone is above the holes in the laterals but not to the top of the stone. So when the level in that drain field is coming up in the drain field, that's where we have a concern. So we already went over the different types of systems. If we go back, we're going to just look at the basic. So here you have, this is a trench system, but you have your septic tank, and then you have your drainage field. That's a trench system. So how do we evaluate how this is functioning? Now, obviously, these tanks have risers up to the top of the ground, but these are all buried maybe 2 to 4 feet, can be 1 to 6 feet, really. How does anyone know how we go about to evaluate that? Probe. Yeah, so most of us don't need to go to the gym. That is our gym. So it does take a lot of manual hard work. Unfortunately, we live in the 21st century, but there's no other tried and proven ways. They had ground penetrating radar, 20 to 30 grand for one of them, and they're right only about 60% of the time. So the day that they come out with technology that I don't have to probe anymore, I don't care if it's 100 grand, we'll get it. Because it's a killer to my wrist, to my shoulders, to about every part of my body. But that's what we're committed to when we're checking out a drain field. So then there are some reasons why we do a load test. So now in interest of your client, as a buyer's realtor, you obviously want your buyer to get something that is going to guarantee, or I shouldn't say guarantee, but that's going to ensure that they're not going to have problems in the future. That's what we do as realtors. We look out for our clients. And so I know there's some myths, and we'll go into that about hydraulic load tests. What is a hydraulic load test? Well, it's actually a test measuring how fast the water is draining through the absorption area. How many of you have heard of a percolation test? Perk test? Okay. A hydraulic load test is pretty much similar to a percolation test. It's just in the existing drain field. A percolation test is done typically on new systems. Before they design a new system, they dig little holes about 6-8 inches in diameter and run water down through to see how fast water runs down through a hole in the ground. By that percolation rate, they then can determine how big and how many square feet you actually need. And so based upon that criteria, you then have a square footage of a drain field. So when we come in and do an HLT, or hydraulic load test, what we're trying to determine is how well is that water going down through the soil. So first thing I want to clear up with all you realtors is a hydraulic load test does not happen to a septic tank. Okay? This only happens to a drain field. Let's go right here. So right here's your tank. That's where your solids sort out. The level stays 8 to 10 inches from the top. That's another thing. Sometimes there's misconceptions as, oh, you look in the tank and it's like 8 inches from full. Wow, that thing needs to be pumped. No, that actually happens within 1 week after it's pumped. So it comes right back to that level. What you're looking for through sludge judge readings and other things is how much scum level there is and how much sludge level there is. So just because it's up here, almost at the top of the tank, that's normal in a septic tank. So you have a septic tank, and then following the septic tank you have, in this case, is just a gravity system. And when we do a load test, we're testing this component, which is not the septic tank, it's a drain field. And one thing you have to check with, or make sure if you're using other providers. Now, we talked about PSMA inspections. We're all certified, and they make it very clear when we put that water in, it's somewhere between this point and this point. That water dare not go in here unless you pump the tank totally out of all solids, fill the tank back up to the outlet pipe, and run water through it. So if someone's coming in doing an HLT and running water through the house to do it, and the tank wasn't pumped first, I have a serious problem with that. I will address that if you let me know, because that should not be happening if they're doing a PSMA inspection. It shouldn't be happening if they're doing a non-PSMA inspection, because what you're going to end up doing is stirring these solids up, and you're going to have the slurry of water solid mixture going out here, and even if it passes your load test, it's going to be quicker to fail down the road. So if you have somebody doing a load test that way, stop them. If they're getting a garden hose and just running in the manhole of the tank, stop them. That's not acceptable. It's got to be at the outlet baffle or in the pipe leaving. So typically in a situation like this where we don't have access to the outlet baffle, we're digging down to the pipe, getting access, either putting a small hole in, or there's a cap right above the baffle, putting the water in there. So just some pointers as realtors to make sure that whoever you're using is doing them correctly. You can do it through the tank, like I said, is if you pump all the solids out, fill it back up with water. That's typically 1,000 gallons, it can be more or less, and then starting the load test out here. And you already talked about probing, how we actually take measurements out here. We drill with the bigger size diameter rods. We drill like an observation hole down, and then with smaller probe rods, we take measurements in that stone. So it's kind of like a dipstick in your car, and we're checking out how well water is moving down through the soil. So this is pretty much standard procedure in any type of newer system, 70s and newer. You have regular gravity in-ground beds. You can also have the pump, like Merle showed earlier, where you have the septic tank, and then you have a pump tank in between, and then you might have a pressure-dosed in-ground bed, where you might have an elevated sand mound, you might have a at-grade bed. There's a number of different types of system. Then you could also have what's called, well, the Ecoflo system, which has the Ecoflo right after the septic tank that then pumps to an at-grade bed. Or you can have things like aerobic tanks, etc. So we still got to probe down to that soil. That's where we're taking all our measurements with. Okay, so what does it do? It mimics the peak operating flows. So on a typical 3-bedroom house, I'm going to see if anybody knows here, how many gallons of water a day would we run for a 3-bedroom house?
400.
All right. And some people are very familiar with HLTs. So that's what we're doing now. If you have clients that are using 400 gallons of water a day, they have some serious issues. Because if you're using 400 gallons of water a day, it's just, so what I do is take the 400, divide it by 2, and really you should never have an average above half of the hydraulic load test. Because when we're doing that load test, it's only for 2 days. Over time, and there's been different Penn State studies that have shown over time, it slows up the hydraulic load test. So you definitely don't want to be using them kind of flows. So what we're doing when we're doing the hydraulic load test is we're determining how well it's going down through that soil, just like a perk test. And we're doing it at the peak flow, because if it passes that, then we know you're going to be good on a regular basis, 200 or less. Then there's other alternatives to doing a load test, and that is getting the house occupied for 30 days. But that's the only other way if you want to avoid a load test on a non-occupied structure. Okay, will an HLT hurt my absorption area? Here's a typical myth. It's going to blow out the system. Okay, I'm sure you probably heard of that already. And that's totally not true, because if it blows out the system, then you have an incompetent provider. That means someone's not doing HLT correctly. Because when the water level gets to the top of the stone, like we've seen here, when it hits right here, you stop. So when we're at that top of that stone, we stop entering water. So if that water comes up to the top of the ground, then that means somebody's not doing an HLT correctly. So that's not true. The only way it is true is if we have a pipe going to the creek, to the surface of the ground, and I'll be happy to blow your system at that point, because that's unacceptable. I mean, who's okay with children's in a creek downstream from your septic? I don't think anybody here is okay with that. That's the only time. Other than that, we do the test accurately. Well, we're going to talk about precipitation, but before that, I would also like to say this thing, oh, it's a lot of gallons. And I agree, 400 gallons is a lot of gallons. If I made up the standards, would I do that? Probably not, okay? But that's the standards that we're following. Something that, is a good standard to go by. But at the same time, this myth of HLTs hardly ever pass is not true. I'm way below 50% failure rate on HLTs. I'm probably more at a 25%. So when you hear HLTs don't usually pass, actually, tell you the truth, I believe I'm actually under 25%. Because way over, I usually over 1 to 4 is the case. So in our case, no, it's probably a quarter at the most of our HLTs that are actually not passing. Well, then here comes the precipitation factor. We had a lot of wet weather, which causes the system to be full of water. Again, not necessarily accurate, but we're going to look at a chart here in the next slide or two. So we're going to talk about this because this is something that is valid. So here we have a chart, which we're going to reference back to. But we're also going to talk about HLTs in the rain, first of all. So for the aggregate to be saturated, we're talking about the stone in the drain field, to the entire depth, which is usually 10 or 12 inches, either 3 unusual, unexpected things must have all occurred. And here it's talking about lots of precipitation, and none of the precipitation ran off, but it all just went straight down the soil into the system, and it didn't leave the absorption area. So in other words, it didn't drain into the soil following it. Here's what I'm going to tell you. No. We here at Sonco do not do HLTs or regular inspections during or around any major rain event. Now, most of the reasons we don't do this has very little to do about the actual impact or the difference that the result of the inspection will be. It has all to do about sellers. Because when we do HLTs in the rain and it doesn't pass, if it passes, nobody cares. Everybody's fine. If it doesn't pass, the first thing a seller will say is, well, of course it didn't pass. You did it in the rain. It could have been barely drizzling, and they said that. So it really doesn't factor much. Now, if it dumped down 4 inches, then they got a point. It could have factored. Let's go back to this chart. So here we're looking, this chart probably doesn't make sense to you, but I'll explain it. Here we're talking a 3-bedroom house. Now, typical for a 3-bedroom, we're seeing sizes right around 700 to 900 square feet. 800 to 1,000, somewhere right in there is typical sizes we're seeing. Here's how much, when we do an HLT at 400 gallons of water a day, it's similar to this. If you had 3/4 of an inch of rain, and that went all into the septic, none ran off, everything soaked in, none soaked into the ground, but went right into the drain field, that's similar. An HLT is similar to 3/4 of an inch of rain. So if you're telling me that rain's a huge factor and that's why it didn't pass, then I gotta tell you that every time we have 3/4 of an inch of rain, your system is failing. Okay, so I'm just using that to combat your argument because it doesn't have any validity. At the same time, you can use this to also say how much water are we putting into a drain field when we do a load test, and when people say, oh, you're blowing out a system, okay? That's the other thing we're trying to dismiss here, is the blowing out the system thing. Well, if we're blowing out your system, then every time you get 3/4 inch of rain, you're blowing out your system. So the factors of, a lot of rainfall versus not, if we're getting 1/4 inch of rain, it's not a factor. But if you're getting an inch of rain, I would say that's a factor. I'm not going to do an HLT when we have an inch of rain. At the same time, some guys will choose to do that. For misunderstandings and stuff, it's not worth it. I'd rather have you do an extension. I know, there's all kinds of things contingent on everything. Nobody wants to do an extension, but do an extension. It's not worth it. Sure, if it passes, nobody cares, but I don't want to take that chance. So that's something we as a company, now, if they're not forecasting rain the next day and we start an HLT and it rains, we're going to do the best we can. And if it doesn't pass and we think that weather could have been a factor and we got an inch of rain overnight, we'll redo it at our own cost if we have to. We're not going to leave that on the table to have us be misrepresented that we did them in the rain. So I want to be clear that we do the best we can not to do it in the rain. So if there's ever times we have to back things up, it's because of that factor. It's because we're trying to keep away from rain events. So even if you're scheduled when it's not rain, we might have had to back the people up that have rain. So we'll try to work with you the best. I know you got deadlines, you got certain 15-day windows that we'll have to work with. Okay, we're going to go with satisfactory with concerns, unsatisfactory, what now? So there's multiple different conclusions. I have a book of the standards of PSMA, and there's quite a few different conclusions, but unsatisfactory is when we get the water to the top of the stone. Once you hit that, then it's unsatisfactory. And then the question is, well, what do we do now? Satisfactory with concerns, most times they can be remediated by doing a simple repair. We, again, are trying to protect your client, the buyer. If you're the seller's realtor, we're also trying to be fair about everything. We really try to be not over picky. If you know us as inspectors, we're not here nitpicking on the little things, but we want to know the basic functionality. So when everything goes sideways, so when we have water levels up to the top of the stone, now what? How to navigate problem system. Well, there's one problem that we're really as a company trying to work with, and that is FHA loans, USDA, VAs, all these that require conventional, that's usually not a problem. All these different types of transactions. So sometimes you have, keeping the original settlement date can be a real struggle, because what do you do when you're 1 month away from settlement and boom, all of a sudden you need a new system. Now I need to schedule perk and pros with the sewage enforcement officer, that could be 2 or 3 weeks. I need to get the thing designed, that could be another week or two. Now, and anything in between there that can prolong it, you could soon be a month and a half before you know what happens, before you have a permit in hand. So there is things that we offer as a company only to a buyer if he has already purchased a PSMA report, and that is called non-PSMA inspections. It's a basic inspection. Now if you have sewage coming out on top of the ground, you ain't getting any of that, because that's a bad problem. It's non-PSMA inspections to help you get to settlement, but you still need to use PSMA inspections to negotiate between the buyer and the seller. But somehow if you can get the bank removed out of the situation, now you can deal directly with your client. And so there's things like that that can be done, kind of the worst case scenario. If we can get that system in before we settle, that's of course the best. That's what everyone likes. We don't want to see escrow accounts. There's times people, I know where they went to settlement, they mailed us a check. We had the perk and probe test done, we knew what type of system, we knew what the cost would be. We came up with an estimate, gave them an invoice, they paid it, it was a done deal, and then once the weather got good, once we got a permit, the design finished, we would then install it. They were able to settle, and you didn't blow a deal apart, because we all know there's so many other deals contingent upon one deal, and so we try our best to do that thing. Now, in relation to that, I do want to talk about the things that factor in when you do that, and not like I'm tooting a horn or anything, but when you do go to the settlement table, the dynamics change. The buyer that now is the owner comes home and he's guaranteed a system. He can be pretty picky because he isn't paying for it, but he wants it to look like perfect. So obviously a construction site isn't going to look perfect, unfortunately. After time, you'll get it seeded, things like that. But so there's all these things that we have to factor in whenever a deal goes to settlement before a system's in. So not it's just all these factors that we have to work with. So when we try to do something like that, just remember there's a lot of liability on our end that we're taking on just to help use out. Now, obviously you have your client in mind, but I think easy realists also have yourself in mind. I mean, after all, you want a commission check. So we're trying to help both yous and your client reach a safe conclusion without necessarily somehow blowing the deal apart because you couldn't either meet certain time periods correctly, whether it's a loan commitment or whatever. So when we move ahead into alternate technologies, we start talking about, okay, so what are your options based upon that perk and probe test? So there's a lot of science that goes into, okay, what makes it that you can do an in-ground versus an at-grade versus a sand mound versus a drip system. And you're talking anywhere from $6,000 up to $30,000. A drip micro mound is the most expensive system, and we're up close to 25 to 30 grand on a system like that. That's kind of the worst case scenario. There still are other worst case scenarios if you can't even do that. We have we were in one in Montgomery County, which has some very lousy soils. We had like about a 3-acre lot, couldn't find anything. They're going to end up with holding tanks. They couldn't do a direct stream discharge the way it seemed. So even $30,000 doesn't cut it. Now you're talking a holding tank system. Yeah, it might only cost $5,000 or $7,000 to install, but you're talking something to a client that's going to cost $100, $150, $200 for the rest of their life a month. And the value of your property is going to be majorly reduced as well. So when we start talking about, the first thing you'll hear me say on an unsatisfactory drain field is, let's do a perk and probe. Let's get that so we know what criteria we're up against. So once we have the perk and probe test, then we have alternatives. So that brings us into, you have alternatives like sand mounds or at-grade beds or in-grounds. Well, I'm totally with Merle here. Sand mounds just don't make sense. Aesthetically, they're horrible. And so that's what the whole presentation is. It brings more awareness of when you do a perk and probe test and you do call for a sand mound, you don't have to take that. There's other alternatives that you can go with. You don't have to accept the sand mound. And so that's how we're getting into Ecoflo septic systems. If you can get a regular at-grade system, typically they run 10 to 12 grand or so. If you can get a regular gravity in-ground system, which less than 10% I'm going to say, get regular gravity in-ground. There are a few, but you have to have really good soils. Then you're talking around 7 grand, somewhere around there. Because since 96, 97, they update the standards where you now need 2 tanks instead of 1 or 2 compartment tank. So that kind of brings us into the different types of system there. And I think with that, maybe just if anyone has any burning questions in relation to septic inspections and what's required. One other thing I want to say is that in the state of Pennsylvania, there is no law on what type of system, what type of inspection you can do. You could do whatever you want. You could go walking through the yard, and if it doesn't, if there's no obvious sewage coming on top of the ground, you can say it's good to go. So there is no criteria in the state of Pennsylvania. However, there's an organization called PSMA that has come up with a lot of good standards how to look at. The only criteria is the sewage enforcement officers that bring up the state standard, which is if it's coming up on top of the ground, if it's entering Commonwealth waters, or if it's backing up in your structure. In relation to the car analogy, that's like the car doesn't run. When we're inspecting it, we're inspecting for things like, is the engine tapping? Is a wheel bearing going out? Is different things like that we're looking for that's way out and above what the baseline, hey, the car doesn't run type scenario. So with that, any other questions? Sure.
So when you say you do a hydraulic test, it's after those tanks.
Yeah.
So testing the system, then what happens from there to the house if the house was vacant for a year or two? Do you test that then as well later on after the hydraulic from there to the house?
No. So one thing I missed when we're doing our regular doing an inspection, we're running all the water, we're running toilets inside the house here, and seeing what kind of flow we're getting. So we're checking the line coming out from the house to make sure we got good flow out to the tank. This tank here, I don't care if it sits a year or 2 years, that thing better be watertight and better stay at the same level. If it doesn't, then you have a leaking tank. Now, something that's a little deceiving there is if it was occupied, you'd probably never catch it. If there's a leaking tank, if it was occupied, you probably never catch it. So it's one of the things, if I sell and unoccupy my house personally, I'm gonna be running water, just in case, that, because of that factor. At the same time, you can have hairline leaks in a seam or something, that really structurally, that tank is fine, but because it's leaking, I gotta tell you, you gotta put a new tank in. And typical cost to replace this component, $3 to $4 grand. $3 to $4 grand to replace this component. If you gotta replace this component, you have to then update this component and add any pump tanks or any Ecoflo units, and that's where you're coming up with 7, 12, 10 to 12 for that grade, and I don't know if typical sand mound systems run 17 to 19,000, but we're actually now that Ecoflo is out, we're seeing a little more competitive numbers on what we can install alternative, excuse me, an alternative system to a sand mound. We're actually seeing most of them coming in around $1,000 to $1,500 less than a sand mound. So it's roughly the same price, but we're seeing some things like that.
You want to talk, Matt, a little bit about how you inspect for bellies in the lines, things like that?
Sure.
And that's, I think it also answers your question a little bit. Whether or not we're doing a hydraulic fluid test, a regular PSMA inspection, this is a type of inspection. They want to inspect every component. Back to the mechanic analogy, they're basically saying a little like, a Carfax report or let's say certified pre-owned. They're going over, they're checking every component. So when you're getting a PSMA inspection, somebody's going through and checking every component to the PSMA standard. That's done whether or not there's a hydraulic fluid test. The reason we spend so much time on hydraulic fluid tests is because it's always that added factor that creates a problem and a pain that people want to know what's going on. But the standard PSMA inspection, you just take a few minutes and talk about what you inspect there.
Yeah, so good point there. So when we run water, we're out here listening for flush sounds. We're running water looking for any unusual lack of surge coming into a tank. We're looking for things in that line that could be, belly in the line, things like that. You can also pay extra and do a camera line inspection. We typically don't do that because our typical flow checks will indicate any major problems. Excuse me. One other factor relation to that is, of course, as soon as you mention HLT, you know what happens with the price. It starts going up. Unfortunately, that's the way it is because it's a 2-day test. One thing I will say, compared to some other people, when we take calls and you tell us, hey, the house is unoccupied, right away we know what we need to do. It's got to be an HLT. So some inspectors will go out to the property, inspect it, come back with a report saying, oh, we recommend more investigation with an HLT. Well, that's foolish. You knew that before you went out. So that makes no sense. So just watch them cut catches because then it can sound cheaper. They'll come in and say, oh, well, now for an HLT, it's only X amount of dollars. Our pricing structure is always included with that HLT, with the inspection. So typical prices run to, I'm gonna give a broad range, but $250 to $350 for a regular inspection, and around $500 to $5 to $7 is on the high end for HLT inspections. So, yeah, other than that, we go over the entire system, whether or not it's an HLT, and make sure all the flows, that there's not water just laying in this stone, things like that.
Matt, why do you have to pump the tank to do inspection? Can you comment on that? What if it was just pumped 3 weeks ago?
So that's another factor. Some sellers will quickly have their tank pumped out. Well, if that tank pump is pumped out 30 days prior to inspection, we can't do a regular inspection. We're going to have to wait 30 days or do an HLT. So if you ever, as a seller's agent, have people that want to pump their tank, say no. Make sure they wait until the septic inspection is going to happen. And then when we're doing the inspection, we check everything else. So we check this, we check flows, we check flows laterally through the tank, make sure the water levels in the stone are good. And once everything else looks good shape, then we move ahead with the tank pumping, and then finish the interior of the tank once it's pumped out.
Can you talk about the longevity of a system and when it would be best to run the load test through the empty tank because of the age of the tank and possible needs?
Again, I mean, the best check on a tank is if it's maintaining that water level. So if it's unoccupied, that level should be right up to these pipes. Running water through isn't going to check the integrity of the tank at all. Running water through just says that these lines are open and going through the tank is open. That doesn't check. So when we do an HLT, running through the tank isn't going to help at all. Now, if you had a tank that was low level, there are times we'll fill it up to the outlet pipe and come back 24 hours later and check and see if it dropped. And if it dropped, now if that's the case, I don't want anyone knowing I'm doing it because then they can fudge it. They can come in, turn a faucet on, things like that to make sure it doesn't. So I'm not going to tell somebody when I'm doing that. I'm just going to like, okay, I need to check the integrity of this thing. So that's something we'll do. And other than that, the water always goes in here because if you put it in here, now if you pump it out, you can do that. It's just more work. So the question is, if this thing is buried 5 feet down and we have no way to get access to this line, there's times we'll pump it, fill it back up, but that means a couple different stops at the creek to get us water because we only have a 750-gallon tank. So we'll have to make a couple trips to that. So we don't do that unless it's deep. It's really deep because if it's deep, I mean, we're digging this up by hand, right here, the pipe or here. So if it's 5 feet deep, we ain't doing that. So, or we might ask permission to bring a mini excavator on site and get down there. But again, we don't want to see this happening if that tank has any solids in it.
You've already stated, Matt, that we run water from the structure for 10 minutes. That's the proved flow laterally from the inlet pipe out the outlet pipe. What else are we looking for when we do that?
Yeah, so we just want to make sure that it doesn't back up in this tank, things like that, because if there's any collapse of the pipe downstream, now this is on a regular inspection because of HLT, we're putting water in here, and we're putting 400, 500, 600 gallons out through here. So if there's any problem with that pipe on HLT, you'll find it. But when we run water through here, we want to make sure it's not backing up in the tank. And making sure that the flows are going through correctly. And if the tank level's low, it'll rise higher. That'll also, we'll be seeing things like that. But then, of course, we're checking flows out to the tank. So. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you still use the dyes, I think?
Okay, good question. Do we do dyes? So if somebody's just doing a dye test, all they're saying is they run a bunch of water through your tank, through your drain field, and it's not coming on top of the ground. That's similar to hopping in a car, and it starts. Oh wow, okay, you're good to go. I mean, I can be a mechanic if that's all it takes, The deal is the dye test idea is really outdated, but there are times we use dye. If we're close to a creek and we have a drain field within 20 feet of the creek, we just had one, Rochelle, where we did that. And lo and behold, dye came on out into the creek. There's no direct pipe, but it moved laterally through the soil and popped up in the creek. And I believe it's safe to say that if ground doesn't filter dye out, then I don't want to be drinking it. That's just my general concept. If you think, yeah, sure, the SEO was being a little smart with me on that when he said, well, is there E. coli? Is there fecal coliforms? What, you expect me to go out there and test dyed water if there's fecal coliforms? If it's not removing the dye, then we got a problem. That's just the general rule of thumb. I mean, I'm not, if you want to go out there and take a cup while I'm doing it, I'll be happy and then we'll talk at the hospital. So, just doesn't make sense. So there are times we do dye, especially when we're getting close to waterways, things like that. where we might not be able to see a pipe entering, but maybe it could be moving up, or the pipe is in underneath the creek bed, and all of a sudden it turns bright green. Now all of a sudden we stop the HLT. Yeah, unfortunately there's direct, I had one old gentleman a couple years back, and I said, he was there as owner, and he said, here's my tank. I said, do you know where your drain field is? And he just starts heading for the creek and walks right to the bank. He's like, right here. He's like, it works great, never backs up. Like, yeah, I guess it won't, unless you have a flood that enters your house, it probably won't. So you have all kinds out there. But one thing we'll get into with the Ecoflo unit is the quality of water. Rejuvenation that you ain't seeing even on standard systems, you're not seeing on at-grade systems. You might see it in a sand mound, but then you have the possibility that sand getting clogged, is the better water quality that's coming out of that. So that therefore there's things you can do. You can take reductions in sizes. There's lots of alternatives. And so Ecoflo is really exciting. And they were exciting before, but because they came out with their newest tank here, which they'll go into this, but it's become really cost effective. They market it at a really reasonable price. It's a tank, peat filter, pump tank, all in one unit. So we're going to hit that a little later, but really amazing stuff that passes up the sand mound by a long shot. Any other questions? Yes?
Your hydraulic load tests, are those done, are people doing them just on unoccupied? Or are they doing it on?
Okay, that's a good question. So anytime there's a major increase in usage, it's recommended. So if one person's living in a 4-bedroom house and 5 people are moving in, we're going to put on a report, it's recommended. Because now the increase of use is going significantly higher, and how do you know that system's going to handle that flow?
What, do you want to talk just, I know you had on the slide, but just reiterate, if you have a marginal system.
Yeah, I was going to do that. Okay. So that's one factor, is if you have increase in usage. The other is, if we're probing down to that stone, and we're only having 1 or 2 inches, or 3, 4 inches of dry stone, but the rest is all wet, then that's a recommendation as well. That's actually, it calls for more investigation with a load test. So if you ever, have stone that's mostly saturated but not quite to the top, because once it gets to the top of the stone, it's unsatisfactory. Once you hit the top of the stone, it's unsatisfactory. So if you have 3/4 full of water and it only has like 2-3 inches, now we're recommending a load test, because it's getting to that uncomfortable zone where we're really concerned about. Let's just go back here. Not sure which slide, maybe it's back further. Yeah, right here, where it's partially full of water and the level of water in the aggregate stone is above the holes in the laterals. So it's in that top couple inches. Then we'll do HLTs there. They typically don't pass too well there, because there's usually the sign of it's coming up, because this biomat is forming. We could go into why drain fields fail, and that is because even though he talked about baffles, filters, things like that, it still is not that great water going out to a drain field. It's marginal water that over time can start creating a biomat. Now, I think someone said about how long the system lasts. We're seeing typical ranges, if the perk and probe test was done right, we're seeing typical ranges between 20 and 30 years. Now, that being said, if you can convince the person to go on vacation for a year, okay, then that system can become like new in 90% of the cases. So if you can let a system rest for a year, year and a half, so on a lot of these foreclosure houses, these load tests are passing perfectly. We come in, they work perfect, because that system has rested. So the house might have fallen apart, the roof might be caving in, whatever. But the septic, so it's funny, so I'll talk to realtors and I'll say, oh, how long's the house been vacant? They're all like, oh, it's not really, I mean, they've been here off and on, and I'm like, oh no, don't tell me that. Tell me it's been like, yeah, it's been like forever it's been unoccupied, because I know when it's unoccupied, it's rejuvenating. So if you sit there telling me, oh, well, it really wasn't that long, I'm actually gonna be like, oh, bummer. because I want to hear that it's been unoccupied. So the main reason being is oxygen is what the bacteria needs to clean that biomass. So you get that scummy water out, it makes this liner in the soil, and it needs oxygen. And if you leave it sit, it eventually can get oxygen. There's ways to expedite that. I don't know if any of you's ever heard of tear lift or soil fracturing. Back in the day, that was allowed. It worked too well, so DEP outlawed it. So.
Hey, Matt,
And what
Yep.
was it?
what if you have technology, and not just an Ecoflo, what if there's technology and you go out and do an inspection? What are you gonna be looking for then?
Okay, good. Yeah, so that's a really good point, Matt. So when you have systems like this, especially Ecoflo units, when you're talking things like, I mean, there's so many different. We didn't even talk about drip system. That's a really high-tech system. But a system like this, first of all, we're checking with the service provider and with the local, really, I guess the local service provider, see what kind of records we have on the service of these things. So on these units, we have a 1-year service. Come out, check the unit, rate the cocoa shells. So we're looking at making sure the basic functionality of that is there and looking at service records. So they may or may not give us permission to open that lid because they may or may not have service records on that. Aerobic systems where you have air being introduced to help clean that. Again, the big thing is to clean that water up. Everybody wants cleaner water so these systems don't fail, because you realistically aren't going to be able to leave a house sit for a year to year and a half. That just is unheard of unless you go to foreclosure or something like that. So on systems like that, we're looking at the basic components of that, making sure that they're working fine. And I'm sure he's going to touch on it more, is the water coming out of these units are that good. Drain fields are usually be fine because all they're doing is just getting rid, just like rain, soil absorbs rain, that's what they're doing. They're getting rid of just regular water. Whereas the reason we're probing out on a lot of these in-ground systems is because over time that biomass builds up, and that's what we're concerned about. One thing I was also going to say along this line is once you have 2 systems on your property and you have what's called a bull run valve that you can alternate, you can go for hundreds of years because you can let one sit, go to the next one. Let it sit, go back to the other one. And so you have something that realistically will last a long, long time. But also if you have a cocoa type of technology, same scenario, because all you're doing is you're taking that biomass that's in this chamber, and every, let's say 10 to 15 years or so, you're pulling that out, sucking it out, and putting other media back in. And again, that's where all your biomass happens, instead of out in the drain field, like all your traditional sand mounds, all your traditional in-ground ZAC grades. It's all happening out in the soil, that biomass. So in this type of system, you get no biomass buildup. All you have is a service and a replacement of that peat, or cocoa, sorry, it used to be peat. So, anything else? Yes?
What's the difference between an unsatisfactory test inspection report and a failed report? I was recently told that unsatisfactory is not a failed septic.
Well, you're right, it's not. So failed is sewage coming out on top of the ground, sewage ending Commonwealth waters. If your local sewage enforcement officer sees that condition, he can send you a notice of violation, and within 60 days, you need to have some process started to alleviate that problem, where you could end up in court. Okay, so that's failed. So that's like, again, very similar to the car not running at all. Unsatisfactory is like I hear tapping your engine. That's what the different similarities are. So if you're as a buyer saying, well, how is it? I'm saying, hey, I hear a tap. Sure, it'll keep working for a little while until it backs up or comes out on top of the ground, but FYI. And see, when the bank's removed, then you can start talking about, well, what are my alternatives? Can we negotiate money? Things like that. And we have some that took place 10, 15 years ago that were unsatisfactory, and people are still using the same system. Okay, it's just like guys could have a tap in their engine for a couple of years. Okay, usually it's going to progress worse, and that's what we're expecting. And when that homeowner goes to sell, he's going to have to shell out the money to somebody because he's at an unsatisfactory condition. So that's what we would like to see. Maybe not septic systems because they were installed, but we would like to see money just traded around. That's what we would like to see, and deals to continue going. And once it gets to failed, but the only way you can do that is by doing perk and probes knowing where your alternative system could be put, because you don't want a situation where all of a sudden you're forced with a drip $30,000 system or a holding tank that devalues the value of the property. So I would love to actually see just money being handed around on unsatisfactory systems, provided you have an alternate site to go with. But in reality, a lot of buyers aren't going to be on board with that. They're just going to be like, nope, got to be in before I buy. And I understand that. It's just me personally, I would be fine with just trading money around because you have it. It's not the go to Bahamas fund. It's not anything like it's for when that system quits that you can move ahead with designing a new system. Any other questions?
I think we're going to go ahead and take a little break. We're going to have another Q&A at the end, so keep your questions. We're going to come back around. And just a clarification on septic systems. I have declared war on the sand mound in southeast PA. There's 6,000 sand mounds go in a year in Pennsylvania. In the more populous region of southeast PA, I think it's reasonable to say there's at least 2,000, maybe 3,000 here. So I have plenty of work to do, and I'm actually going to say I agree with Matt. I would rather see solutions that go to the settlement table, and I'm just going to put my crosshairs on when a new system goes in. It's not going to be the same amount, and I have plenty of work to do. So we're going to take a little quick break. It's 8 o'clock right now. 5-7 minutes, something like that. 10 at the very most. Let's be back, and we're going to turn the time to Matt, and he's going to talk about why we don't need to do sand mounds anymore.